The maid was dismissed after the millionaire's wife accused her of theft. But no one imagined the shocking truth that would unravel and change their lives forever. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. Sophia's hands worked quickly, the familiar feel of the polished rag smooth in her fingers as she rubbed it against the silver doorknobs of the Rossi mansion. Her muscles moved on autopilot, even as her mind wandered. There was always so much to think about. Bills. Doctor appointments. Her father. How much longer could she keep this going? The sprawling Rossi mansion, all sleek lines and imposing grandeur, was nothing like the cramped apartment she shared with her father. It was more of a showpiece than a home, built to impress anyone who dared step through the grand front doors. Sophia had scrubbed every inch of it, day after day, for nearly a year now. A year of long hours, aching feet, and pretending not to exist among the wealthy residents who hardly glanced her way. Her father's illness had taken a toll, not just on him, but on Sophia too. The hospital bills seemed endless, and her contract as a maid was nearing its end. She'd saved, yes, but not nearly enough to cover the mounting costs of his care. A part of her dreaded the end of her time at the mansion. Without this job, what would they do? She didn't have the luxury of imagining a way out, this was survival. Mrs. Rossi swept into the room like she always did, a perfectly manicured storm of silk and disdain. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floor as she glanced around, taking in every detail. She never missed anything, whether it was a speck of dust on the windowsill or a misplaced vase. And if something was out of place, everyone would hear about it. Sophia, Mrs. Rossi's voice rang out, snapping Sophia from her thoughts. Yes, ma'am? Sophia answered, straightening her back and looking up from her work. She knew better than to show even a hint of fatigue. Mrs. Rossi was, without a doubt, the most demanding woman Sophia had ever worked for. Everything had to be perfect at all times. Sophia had learned early on that nothing was ever truly perfect in Mrs. Rossi's eyes. Don't forget to clean the study today. We're having guests tonight, and I want everything flawless. Her tone was clipped, as if the very idea that it wouldn't be flawless was absurd. Yes, ma'am, Sophia nodded, already planning her route through the mansion in her head. The study was one of the few rooms she actually liked cleaning. It was quiet, private, and, unlike the rest of the house, untouched by Mrs. Rossi's critical eye. As Mrs. Rossi turned to leave, Sophia's eyes caught the glint of something on the woman's wrist, a diamond-encrusted bracelet. Sophia had always noticed the way Mrs. Rossi adorned herself with lavish jewelry, flaunting it as if it were a second skin. But there was one piece of jewelry that stood out above the rest, one that Mrs. Rossi prized above all others. The brooch. Sophia had only seen it a handful of times, usually when Mrs. Rossi was attending some high society event. The brooch, a stunning piece encrusted with diamonds, had been passed down through generations of the Rossi family. It was famous, not only for its beauty but also for the stories that swirled around it, rumors of its history, of how it was linked to the family's rise in power and influence. Mrs. Rossi was obsessed with it. She treated the brooch like it was alive, something more valuable than anything else in the mansion, even her husband. Every time it left the safety of its glass display case, she hovered over it, watching with eagle eyes, never letting anyone get too close. For Sophia, the brooch represented everything that separated her world from theirs. While Mrs. Rossi clung to wealth and status, Sophia scraped by, hoping every day that her father would survive long enough to see the next. As Mrs. Rossi's footsteps faded down the hallway, Sophia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She moved quickly to finish polishing the last of the silver in the dining room, her thoughts drifting back to her father. How long could he hold on? The doctors had been clear, his condition was worsening. The treatments were helping, but without more intensive care, it was only a matter of time. Sophia pushed the thought away, knowing she had no other option but to keep working. She had to finish this contract and pray she'd be able to find another job soon. The clock struck noon, and Sophia wiped her hands on her apron before heading to the study. The house was quieter now, the midday lull that always seemed to fall over the Rossi estate. She opened the heavy wooden door to the study, grateful for the calm that greeted her. The study smelled of leather and wood polish, and the large windows let in beams of light that reflected off the glass cabinets housing books and mementos. Sophia began dusting the shelves, careful not to disturb the items that lined them. As she worked, her mind wandered again. She wondered what life would have been like if things had been different. If her father hadn't gotten sick, if her mother had still been alive. She quickly brushed those thoughts aside. Dwelling on what could have been didn't change what was. Halfway through dusting the second shelf, Sophia froze. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as she realized something was missing from the glass case across the room. The brooch. Sophia's heart raced as she stepped closer to the display. The case was empty, the velvet lining where the brooch usually rested glaringly bare. Mrs. Rossi's prized heirloom, gone. Her hands shook as she stared at the empty spot. Could she have forgotten that Mrs. Rossi had taken it out earlier? She replayed the day in her mind, but no, she would have noticed. She always noticed. Before she could gather her thoughts, the door to the study opened behind her. Mrs. Rossi stood in the doorway, her eyes immediately locking onto the empty display case. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Mrs. Rossi's eyes narrowed, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Sophia, Mrs. Rossi's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. Where is the brooch? Sophia swallowed hard. I don't know, ma'am. I didn't touch it. Don't lie to me, Mrs. Rossi snapped, stepping forward. Her eyes were cold, filled with suspicion. You're the only one who's been in this room today. I swear, ma'am, I didn't. I don't want to hear it, Mrs. Rossi cut her off. You'll leave this house immediately. And don't think for a second you'll get away with this. I will find out what happened to my brooch. Sophia stood frozen as Mrs. Rossi stormed out of the room. The weight of the accusation pressed down on her, suffocating. This wasn't just about losing her job. If Mrs. Rossi truly believed she had stolen the brooch, her reputation would be ruined. And with it, any hope of finding another position. But more than that, her father's future now hung in the balance. Sophia stood in the middle of the study, her mind spinning, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of Mrs. Rossi's accusation settled like a stone in her gut. She had known, from the very moment she saw the empty case, that the blame would fall on her. It was too easy, too convenient. A maid with a sick father in need of money, alone in the room when the brooch disappeared, it was the perfect story. But it wasn't true. She had never even thought of touching the heirloom. She wouldn't dream of it. For all the years of scrubbing, cleaning, and polishing in this mansion, she had kept her head down and her hands clean. She needed this job too much to risk anything. And now, in the blink of an eye, it was slipping away. Sophia took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. The last thing she could do was lose her composure. Mrs. Rossi would never believe her if she saw fear or hesitation. She had to be steady, sure. And, more than that, she had to prove her innocence. But how? The house was abuzz with activity, preparations for the evening event in full swing. Guests would soon arrive, and Mrs. Rossi would be hosting them with her usual grace and control. The thought of facing them all now, with the brooch missing and the suspicion hanging over her, sent a cold wave of dread through Sophia. She needed to speak to Marco. He was the only one who might listen, the only one who wouldn't jump to conclusions. With determined steps, she walked through the long hallways of the mansion, weaving past staff who were hurrying to prepare the house for the evening. Everyone seemed on edge, likely sensing the undercurrent of tension that had exploded with the disappearance of the brooch. She found Marco in his office, seated behind his wide desk, reviewing papers as if nothing unusual had happened. His sharp eyes lifted when Sophia knocked lightly on the door. Mr. Rossi, Sophia started, stepping into the room, I need to speak with you. It's important. Marco put down his pen and leaned back in his chair, regarding her with a mix of curiosity and weariness. He looked like a man who had too many responsibilities and not enough time to deal with them all. "Sophia," he said, his tone measured, "I already know. My wife told me about the brooch." Sophia swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I didn't take it. I would never steal from you. I've worked here for nearly a year, and I've never given you or Mrs. Rossi a reason to doubt me. I don't know what happened to it, but I didn't do it." Marco sighed, rubbing his temples. "I believe that you're a hard worker, Sophia. You've been nothing but diligent since you've been here. But the brooch is gone, and my wife is certain that you're the only one who was in the study." Sophia's heart sank. There it was, the doubt, the suspicion creeping into his words, even if his voice wasn't as harsh as his wife's. She needed him to see her side, to trust her, even just a little. "Mrs. Rossi is wrong," Sophia insisted, her voice firm but respectful. "I was cleaning, yes, but I never touched the case. I never even went near it. If I had seen something suspicious, I would have reported it immediately. You know that." He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Then, finally, he leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. "You know how much that brooch means to her, right?" Sophia nodded. Of course she knew. The whole staff knew. The brooch wasn't just a piece of jewelry to Mrs. Rossi. It was her legacy, her status, her claim to the Rossi family. She flaunted it at every opportunity, ensuring that everyone who saw her knew she was not just a rich woman, but a woman with history, with power. And now it was gone, just hours before she would have been showing it off to their high society guests. "I can't afford to lose this job, Mr. Rossi," Sophia said, her voice softening. "If I lose this job, my father's treatment will stop. You have to believe me." Marco sighed again, leaning back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "I don't think you took it," he said finally, his voice quiet. "But the fact is, it's missing, and you were the only one in the room when it disappeared." Sophia opened her mouth to argue, to plead her case, but before she could speak, the office door burst open. Mrs. Rossi swept in, her eyes flashing with anger. "I told you she did it," Mrs. Rossi snapped, her voice sharp. "What are you waiting for, Marco? Fire her. She's a thief. She stole the brooch, and I want her out of this house before the guests arrive." Sophia's pulse quickened. She turned to face Mrs. Rossi, standing tall, despite the wave of panic threatening to wash over her. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice steady but full of conviction. Mrs. Rossi sneered. "You expect us to believe that? You, a maid, with a sick father who needs expensive medical treatment, and now my brooch is conveniently missing? How dare you lie to my face?" Marco held up a hand, silencing his wife for the moment. "Clara, wait. There's nothing to wait for." Mrs. Rossi's eyes flashed as she glared at her husband. "She's guilty, and she needs to be out of this house, now." Marco shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, caught between his wife's rage and his own uncertainty. Sophia could see it in his eyes, he didn't want to fire her, but he was under pressure. Mrs. Rossi wasn't someone who took defiance lightly. "Let's not rush into this," Marco said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll talk to the staff, see if anyone else noticed anything. We don't need to make decisions right away." "We most certainly do need to make decisions." Mrs. Rossi's voice rose again, filled with fury. "I will not be made a fool of tonight, Marco. I will not have a thief working under my roof, touching my things, stealing from me." Sophia felt the room closing in, the air thick with tension. She wanted to defend herself, to shout the truth, but what good would it do? Mrs. Rossi had made up her mind, and the longer Sophia stood there, the clearer it became that her words wouldn't change anything. Marco rose from his chair, his expression tight. "Sophia, go back to your quarters for now. We'll talk about this later." Sophia opened her mouth to protest, to plead her case once more, but the look on Marco's face told her it was pointless. He didn't want to make a scene, not with Mrs. Rossi's temper simmering on the edge of an explosion. With a heavy heart, Sophia turned and left the office, her head held high even though her future seemed to crumble with every step she took. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to give up. Not yet. The kitchen buzzed with the typical pre-party frenzy. Pots clanged, dishes piled up, and the hurried footsteps of the staff echoed off the gleaming tile floors. It was a well-oiled machine, every maid, cook, and butler knowing their place in the whirlwind of preparation for the Rossi event that evening. But today, Sophia wasn't a part of the rhythm. She stood in the doorway, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her stomach knotted with dread. The accusation hung over her like a storm cloud, and she could feel the staff's eyes on her as she moved. The whispers had already begun. "She did it," one of the maids whispered, not even bothering to hide her voice. "Took the brooch, no doubt about it. People like us, they get desperate." Sophia bit back a sharp retort. She couldn't afford to lash out, not now, not when everything was on the line. The truth didn't seem to matter anymore. All that mattered was perception, and Mrs. Rossi had crafted a perfect narrative around Sophia's supposed guilt. A sharp heel clattered against the floor, followed by the unmistakable presence of Mrs. Rossi. She swept into the kitchen like a tempest, her fur-lined coat draped over her shoulders, her diamond earrings glinting in the harsh light. "Everyone, stop," she demanded, her voice cutting through the air. The entire room fell silent, the clattering of pots and the chopping of vegetables abruptly halting. All eyes turned to her. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. This was it. Mrs. Rossi was about to tear her apart in front of everyone. Her throat tightened, and she fought the urge to run, to disappear before the humiliation could begin. Mrs. Rossi's cold gaze landed on her, and her lips curled in disdain. "I won't stand for it," Mrs. Rossi said, her voice low but carrying through the room. "A thief among us. Stealing from this house, from me. It's despicable." Sophia's pulse quickened. Every pair of eyes in the room seemed to burn into her, waiting for what would come next. She wanted to speak, to shout that she wasn't a thief, but no words came. It felt like being trapped in a nightmare, where your voice is gone, and there's no way to defend yourself. Mrs. Rossi stepped closer, her heels clicking against the floor with each measured step. "You all know Sophia," she continued, gesturing toward her with a sharp flick of her hand. "You've worked beside her, seen her every day. And today, you will see what happens when trust is broken." Sophia's chest tightened as Mrs. Rossi moved even closer, her voice gaining strength. "She stole from me," Mrs. Rossi spat, her tone filled with venom. "The brooch, the Rossi family heirloom. Gone. And she was the only one in that room. She, who has been nothing but an opportunist since she walked into this house." Sophia's heart pounded. She opened her mouth to speak, to say anything, but Mrs. Rossi's icy glare cut her off before she could get a single word out. "Don't even try to defend yourself," Mrs. Rossi hissed. "You'll have plenty of time to do that when you're begging for another job, though I doubt anyone will hire you now." Sophia's face flushed with humiliation. She could feel the staff's eyes on her, but no one said a word in her defense. Not a single voice spoke up. The room, once filled with the sounds of work, had become suffocatingly silent. Her shame pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't bear to lift. "Mrs. Rossi," Sophia finally managed, her voice shaky but determined, "I didn't take the brooch. I would never steal from you." Mrs. Rossi's eyes narrowed, her lips twisting into a sneer. "Of course you would. Your father's medical bills? You think I don't know? It was only a matter of time before you decided to take what wasn't yours." The words hit Sophia harder than any slap. They were cruel, calculated. Mrs. Rossi knew exactly where to strike to make the pain cut deepest. Before Sophia could respond, Marco appeared in the doorway. He glanced between his wife and Sophia, his jaw tight, his eyes full of something like regret. He'd heard everything. Sophia could see it in the way his gaze softened slightly when it landed on her. "Marco," Mrs. Rossi turned to him, her voice sharp, "tell her she's done here. Fire her." There was a long moment where Sophia held her breath, praying for some kind of miracle, some intervention from Marco. He had always been more reasonable, more understanding than his wife. Surely, he wouldn't let her go like this. But when he spoke, his voice was low, resigned. "Sophia, you should go." The final blow. Sophia's chest tightened as the reality sank in. Fired. Just like that. Her father's medical bills, their rent, everything was riding on this job. And now, it was all gone, crumbling before her eyes. Mrs. Rossi's face lit up with satisfaction, and she waved her hand dismissively. "You heard him. Get out." The room remained deathly silent as Sophia gathered her things, every step heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The whispers would follow her, the accusations and the shame. And the worst part was, no one had even tried to stop it. No one had stood up for her. With her head held high, Sophia made her way through the winding halls, the laughter and clinking glasses from the party preparations muffled behind closed doors. But her mind was a blur. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? As she neared the back door, the sound of hushed voices caught her ear. Instinctively, she paused, pressing herself against the wall, hidden in the shadows. She recognized the low, familiar voice of Mrs. Rossi. "What matters is that the brooch is safe," Mrs. Rossi whispered harshly. A deeper voice, one Sophia didn't recognize, replied, "You're sure no one suspects?" "Of course. She's gone now, isn't she?" Mrs. Rossi snapped. "The money from the insurance will be more than enough to cover the loss." Sophia's blood ran cold. Insurance? Loss? She strained to hear more, but the voices faded as they moved farther down the hallway. Her heart raced, her mind whirling with the implications of what she had just overheard. The brooch hadn't been stolen after all. Mrs. Rossi had staged the whole thing. A mixture of anger and disbelief welled up inside Sophia. She had been set up, fired, humiliated, and branded a thief, all to cover for Mrs. Rossi's deception. Sophia slipped out of the mansion, her head spinning. The weight of the day pressed down on her, but there was one thing she knew for sure now. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The cold night air hit Sophia the moment she stepped out of the Rossi mansion, sending a shiver down her spine. She clutched her coat tighter around her, the humiliation of the day still fresh in her mind. But beneath the shame and anger was a fire, one that had been ignited by the conversation she'd overheard. The brooch wasn't stolen. It was hidden. And now, Mrs. Rossi planned to collect insurance money for it. She wouldn't get away with it. Sophia was determined to prove it. Her small apartment wasn't far from the mansion, but tonight the walk felt longer, her feet dragging beneath her as the weight of her situation pressed down on her. Losing the job had felt like the end of everything. No income meant her father's care was at risk, his treatments halted. But this new discovery was a lifeline. If she could clear her name, maybe she could salvage her reputation and find work again. And maybe, just maybe, there was justice for what had been done to her. The moment Sophia stepped inside the small, dim apartment, she went straight to the kitchen table. She dropped her bag onto the floor and sat down, pulling out a notepad and pen. If she was going to prove anything, she'd need more than what she'd overheard. She needed facts, connections, something solid to expose Mrs. Rossi. First, she scribbled down what she knew. Mrs. Rossi had staged the theft to collect insurance money on the brooch. The man she'd spoken to had sounded like an accomplice, someone involved in making sure the plan went off without a hitch. The brooch itself was clearly worth more than just sentimental value. Mrs. Rossi had said the insurance payout would be enough to cover the loss. What loss? A piece like that, insured for millions, would be a game changer if someone was desperate enough. Sophia rubbed her temples. How was she going to find the proof? Her mind raced as she thought back to her time working in the mansion. She had seen enough over the past year to know that Mrs. Rossi was ruthless. There had been whispers among the staff, rumors that circulated about Mrs. Rossi's control over Marco, her obsession with appearances, and her desire for power. She always seemed to know where the money was, and no one dared cross her. Sophia knew she needed to talk to someone who had seen more than she had. The former workers at the Rossi mansion might hold the key. Many of them had left abruptly, without explanation. Had Mrs. Rossi driven them away? Were they witnesses to her scheming? The next morning, Sophia was up early. She couldn't waste any time. She spent the day tracking down former staff members, hoping someone would be willing to talk. Her first stop was Elisa, the former housekeeper, who had suddenly left the mansion 6 months earlier. Sophia remembered the day Elisa had packed up, saying nothing about why she was leaving after 5 years of working there. It had always seemed strange. Elisa had been dedicated, loyal, and Mrs. Rossi had trusted her more than most of the staff. When Sophia arrived at Elisa's small home, she was greeted with a look of surprise, but not hostility. Elisa invited her inside and poured them both a cup of tea. Sophia wasted no time explaining why she was there. "I need your help, Elisa. Something's wrong at the Rossi mansion, and I think Mrs. Rossi is behind it. She accused me of stealing the family brooch, but I overheard her talking about insurance money. I think she's trying to pull a scam." Elisa's face hardened as Sophia spoke, and by the time she finished, Elisa let out a long sigh. "I'm not surprised," Elisa said, shaking her head. "That woman is capable of anything when it comes to money and control. She's been running things there for years, manipulating everyone, including Marco." Sophia leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Elisa took a slow sip of tea before speaking. "I stayed quiet because I needed the job, but there were things I saw, things I heard. Mrs. Rossi has always been obsessed with Marco's business and their money. She controls everything in that house. Marco might be the face of the Rossi name, but she's the one who runs the show. She keeps a tight grip on the finances, even making decisions about his investments without telling him." Sophia's stomach twisted. "And the staff? Why did so many people leave?" Elisa set down her cup, her expression somber. She had a way of getting rid of people who knew too much. If you questioned her or found out something she didn't want you to know, you were gone. It's why I left. I couldn't take it anymore, knowing what she was capable of. It's not just about money, it's about power. She'll do anything to keep control." Sophia's heart raced. This was bigger than she had thought. If Mrs. Rossi was this manipulative, she could have been staging all kinds of things to secure her power, including this supposed theft. "And the brooch?" Sophia pressed. "Do you think she could have hidden it to collect insurance money?" Elisa nodded. "Absolutely. That brooch is worth a fortune. If she's desperate for more money, it wouldn't surprise me if she'd do something like that. She's always been greedy, and if Marco's investments have been shaky lately, she might see this as an easy way to secure their wealth." Sophia sat back, her mind spinning. She was getting closer, but she needed more. "Do you know if the brooch was insured for a large amount?" "I'm sure of it," Elisa said. She made a big deal about getting it insured not long after she had it appraised. It was insured for millions. She even bragged about it at one of the parties. Millions. Sophia's heart pounded. This wasn't just about the brooch, it was about a desperate woman trying to hold on to her lifestyle, her power, her influence. Elisa sighed again, glancing toward the window. "Sophia, I don't know what you're planning to do, but be careful. Mrs. Rossi won't hesitate to destroy anyone who gets in her way." Sophia nodded, feeling the weight of those words. She knew the risks, but she couldn't let this go. Mrs. Rossi had framed her, stolen her job, and put her father's life in jeopardy. Now, Sophia had something that could bring her down. As she left Elisa's house, Sophia's mind churned with the next steps. She had the start of something, rumors, suspicions, and a potential motive. But she needed more. She needed proof. The brooch was still out there, and if she could find it or get someone on the inside to talk, she could expose Mrs. Rossi for who she really was. The rain came down in a steady drizzle as Sophia trudged back to her apartment, her thoughts spinning with everything Elisa had told her. The heavy gray clouds above mirrored the turmoil swirling inside her. She needed more than rumors and suspicions. If she was going to clear her name and expose Mrs. Rossi, she had to find proof, real, undeniable proof. When she walked into the small, dim apartment, her father was asleep in his worn recliner, a blanket pulled up to his chin. Sophia's heart tightened as she watched him. He looked older than his years, the lines on his face deepening every day. His illness had taken so much from him, from them both. She'd done everything she could to hold their lives together, but now, with her job gone, everything felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Quietly, Sophia moved to the small kitchen table, where her father's old leather briefcase sat. She needed something to focus on, anything to take her mind off the suffocating sense of helplessness. The briefcase contained all the family documents, bills, medical records, old letters, everything that tied them to their past. She hadn't gone through it in years. Maybe there was something there, some forgotten paperwork that could help her figure out the next step. As she sifted through the yellowing papers, her fingers brushed against a thick envelope tucked deep inside one of the pockets. It was old, the edges worn and creased, but it was sealed, and her father's familiar handwriting scrawled across the front in faded ink. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized her mother's name on the envelope. Sophia hesitated, a strange feeling settling over her as she stared at the letter. Her mother had left years ago, disappearing without a word. Sophia had been too young to understand at the time, but the questions had lingered ever since. Where had she gone? Why had she left? Her father had never spoken about it, never given her answers, and eventually, Sophia had stopped asking. But now, with the letter in her hands, Sophia felt a deep sense of unease. She opened the envelope carefully, pulling out the folded sheets inside. The paper was brittle with age, but the writing was still legible. As she began to read, her heart started to race. The letter was from her mother, written years ago. And it told a story Sophia had never imagined. Her mother had been involved with Marco Rossi before she'd met Sophia's father. The letter revealed that Sophia was, in fact, Marco's daughter, conceived during their affair. Sophia's hands trembled as she read the words. Her mother had left the city to protect her. She hadn't wanted Sophia to grow up in the shadow of the Rossi family, knowing how ruthless they were, knowing the danger that came with their wealth and power. She'd never wanted Sophia to find out the truth. But here it was, staring back at her in black and white. Marco Rossi wasn't just the man who had fired her, he was her father. Sophia stood frozen, the weight of the revelation sinking in. She had spent years wondering about her mother's disappearance, about why she had abandoned them, and now she finally had her answer. But it was far from the one she'd expected. Her father had never known the truth. He had no idea that Sophia existed. Her mother had kept her hidden, far away from the world that could have given her a life of luxury, but also a life of manipulation and secrets. The more Sophia thought about it, the more it made sense. Mrs. Rossi's hostility toward her, the cold glances, the way she had always been on edge around Sophia, it wasn't just because she was a maid. Mrs. Rossi had known something, or at least suspected it. And if she'd known that Sophia was Marco's daughter, she would have done anything to keep that secret buried. She would have seen Sophia as a threat to everything she had built, to the life she had secured as Marco's wife. Sophia sat back in the chair, the letter still clutched in her hands. Her mother's departure had always seemed abrupt, almost mysterious, as if something darker had been at play. Now, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Rossi had been involved, that she had played a part in driving her mother away. Could she have known about the affair? Had she threatened her mother, forced her to leave? The thought made Sophia's skin crawl. If Mrs. Rossi had been ruthless enough to fake the theft of her own brooch for money, there was no telling what lengths she would have gone to in order to protect her marriage and her status. Sophia could see it clearly now, Mrs. Rossi had orchestrated everything to maintain control, to eliminate anyone who stood in her way. Including Sophia's mother. The pieces were starting to come together, but Sophia still needed proof. She needed something to confirm that Mrs. Rossi had been involved, that she had driven her mother out of the city, leaving Sophia behind to grow up without knowing the truth. Her mind raced, thinking back to the mansion, to the hidden conversations and the secretive glances. There had to be something there, some clue she had missed, something that would tie Mrs. Rossi to the past. And then, it hit her. Mrs. Rossi's conversations with that mysterious man, the one she'd overheard talking about the brooch, about money. What if it wasn't just about the insurance scam? What if he had been involved in her mother's disappearance all those years ago? Sophia's pulse quickened. She needed to find that man. He was the key to unlocking the truth, to exposing Mrs. Rossi for everything she had done. The letter felt heavy in Sophia's coat pocket as she walked up the long driveway to the Rossi mansion. She had spent the night tossing and turning, the words from her mother's letter echoing in her mind. Each time she read it, the truth hit her harder. Marco Rossi, the man who had so casually dismissed her, the man she had worked for and feared, was her father. And now, she was going to confront him with it. Her breath fogged in the chilly afternoon air as she approached the front door. Sophia had thought long and hard about how to handle this. Marco needed to know the truth, but it wasn't just about him. It was about her mother, about the lies that had been woven into their lives, and about Mrs. Rossi's manipulation that had undoubtedly played a role in it all. This wasn't a conversation Sophia wanted to have, but she had no choice. The truth had been kept from her for too long, and now that she knew, there was no going back. She wasn't just confronting Marco for herself. She was confronting him for the mother who had disappeared from her life, leaving a gaping hole where answers should have been. The butler who opened the door recognized her immediately. His face betrayed surprise, but before he could speak, Sophia cleared her throat. "I need to see Mr. Rossi," she said firmly. "It's urgent." He hesitated, but something in her tone must have convinced him, because he nodded and stepped aside. "He's in his study." "I'll tell him you're here." Sophia waited in the grand foyer, the familiar surroundings feeling foreign to her now. This was no longer just the mansion where she'd worked tirelessly. It was the home of her father, the man who had unknowingly turned his back on her before she was even born. The thought twisted her insides, but she pushed the anger aside. This wasn't about punishing Marco. This was about the truth. The butler returned a moment later, gesturing for her to follow him down the hall. Sophia's heart pounded louder with every step. By the time they reached Marco's study, her hands were clammy, her throat dry. "He's waiting for you," the butler said, before leaving her to face what lay ahead. Sophia stood outside the heavy wooden door for a moment, gathering her courage. Then, without knocking, she pushed it open and stepped inside. Marco sat behind his large oak desk, his brow furrowed as he looked up from a stack of papers. The room smelled of leather and wood polish, familiar yet oppressive. His expression shifted from curiosity to confusion when he saw her. "Sophia," he said, leaning back in his chair. "What are you doing here?" "I thought." He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable after their last encounter. Sophia hadn't expected him to be at ease, but she wasn't here for small talk. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the letter, holding it up for him to see. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady. "About my mother. And about you." Marco's confusion deepened, his gaze flickering from the letter to her face. "What's this about?" Sophia stepped forward, her fingers trembling slightly as she placed the letter on his desk. "Read it," she said simply. Marco hesitated, but there was something in her tone that left no room for argument. He picked up the letter, unfolding the fragile paper carefully. As he began to read, Sophia watched his face closely, waiting for the moment he would realize the gravity of what he was holding. It didn't take long. His eyes widened as he scanned the words, his jaw tightening. When he reached the end of the letter, Marco sat back in his chair, a look of disbelief and something deeper, something like guilt, clouding his features. This can't be right," he muttered, though the shock in his voice suggested he knew it was true. Your mother. Clara? Sophia nodded, crossing her arms over her chest to steady herself. My mother, she said quietly. She left the city, disappeared without a word. I never knew why. Until now. Marco stared at the letter again, as if willing the words to change, but they didn't. The truth was staring him in the face, and there was no escaping it. I didn't know, he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. Sophia, I didn't know she was pregnant. If I had known. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, as if the weight of what he'd missed was too much to bear. The years he had lost, the daughter he had never known, it was all crashing down on him at once. Sophia's heart clenched at the sight of him, at the raw emotion on his face. She hadn't expected this reaction. She had been prepared for anger, for denial. But what she saw in Marco was something else, regret. Deep, painful regret. You didn't know, Sophia said softly, though the words were hard for her to say. But you left her. You left my mother, and she was forced to leave the city, to raise me alone. Marco shook his head, running a hand through his graying hair. I didn't leave her, he said, his voice hoarse. We were separated. Clara's family, her father, they didn't approve of our relationship. He made sure we couldn't be together. I tried, Sophia. I tried to find her, but when she left, I thought it was over. I didn't know. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and for a moment, Sophia felt the anger she'd been holding on to start to waver. But there was still so much more, so many unanswered questions. She couldn't let it go. Maybe you didn't know, she said, her voice gaining strength. But someone else did. Someone who's been trying to keep this secret buried. Marco's brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Sophia took a deep breath. Mrs. Rossi, she said, the name bitter on her tongue. She's been manipulating you for years. And I think she knew. I think she knew about me, about my mother. I think she had a hand in forcing her out of your life. Marco's face went pale, his expression hardening. She wouldn't have. She did, Sophia pressed. And I think she's the reason my mother disappeared. I think she forced her to leave so that you would never find out about me. So that you would stay with her. The room fell into a heavy silence as Marco absorbed the words. Sophia could see the war waging inside him, disbelief, anger, and the growing realization that everything he thought he knew was unraveling. I need to talk to her, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Sophia nodded, her heart pounding. The confrontation was far from over, but the truth was finally out. The weight of Sophia's words hung in the air long after she had left Marco's study. The truth, sharp and unavoidable, settled deep in Marco's chest. His thoughts were a jumble: shock, regret, confusion. The revelation of Sophia being his daughter clawed at him, reopening old wounds he had long buried. Clara, the woman he had loved and lost so many years ago, had carried their child in secret. And now, Sophia stood before him as the living embodiment of everything he had missed. But instead of rushing to act, Marco felt paralyzed. The enormity of the situation was too much to process all at once. He needed time to think, time to understand what had happened, and most of all, time to figure out what to do next. He sat in silence for what felt like hours, staring at the letter Sophia had left behind. His mind replayed the moments of their conversation, her accusations against his wife, Clara's name echoing through the halls of his memory. The deeper he thought, the more fragmented everything felt. Guilt seeped into him. How could he have been so blind? He had trusted in his marriage, in the life he and Mrs. Rossi had built together. He had never imagined the possibility of deception, at least not to this extent. But Sophia's accusations. They lingered. The idea that his wife could have orchestrated Clara's disappearance, could have knowingly kept his daughter from him, twisted Marco's stomach. That night, Marco barely slept. He didn't confront his wife as Sophia had suggested. Instead, he withdrew into himself, mulling over what to do. In the quiet, he replayed conversations he'd had with his wife over the years, moments that now seemed veiled in suspicion. Her controlling tendencies, her obsession with the family's finances, the way she had subtly pushed him away from his past. It had all seemed like normal behavior for a woman of her stature, a woman who thrived on power and control. But now Marco wondered how much of his life had been dictated by her manipulations. The next morning, Marco rose early, the sleepless night leaving him groggy but determined. He needed to know more, needed to understand whether Sophia's suspicions about Mrs. Rossi had merit. If there was truth in what Sophia had said, he would need proof before taking any action. With that in mind, Marco turned his attention to the one thing his wife had always been protective of, their finances. He hadn't questioned it much over the years. Mrs. Rossi had always been involved in managing their money, keeping a tight hold on their accounts, their investments. She insisted on it, saying it was her way of keeping the household in order. Marco had always been more focused on the business side of things, trusting her judgment when it came to their personal wealth. But now, as he logged into the financial system for the first time in years, he realized just how much he had been left in the dark. It didn't take long for the discrepancies to surface. Marco noticed large, unexplained withdrawals from their joint accounts, money funneled into accounts he had never seen before. Some of the transactions went back years, long before Sophia had started working in the mansion. The amounts were staggering, far more than he could have imagined. Where had this money gone? And why had it been hidden from him? As Marco delved deeper, he uncovered a series of financial irregularities that painted a picture he hadn't expected. Mrs. Rossi had been moving money out of their accounts, using it for her own purposes. Some of the transfers were disguised as business expenses or investments, but there were others that led to offshore accounts Marco knew nothing about. His heart sank as the truth began to take shape. His wife had been siphoning money from their shared wealth for years, building her own empire in the shadows. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Marco had trusted Mrs. Rossi, had relied on her to manage their finances while he focused on the family business. He had never once thought to question her decisions. But now, he realized, he should have. How many more secrets had she kept from him? If she had been capable of manipulating their finances this way, what else had she done? The more he uncovered, the more Marco knew he couldn't confront her directly, not yet. He needed time to gather all the evidence, to protect what was left of his fortune and ensure that Sophia's future, his daughter's future, wasn't at risk. Mrs. Rossi was clever, and Marco had no doubt she would fight to maintain control if she suspected anything. So he stayed quiet. He didn't mention the financial irregularities to her. Instead, he distanced himself, creating the space he needed to think clearly. He hired private investigators, not only to continue digging into the financial discrepancies, but to look into Mrs. Rossi's past as well. If she had indeed played a role in Clara's disappearance, Marco needed to know for certain. The guilt gnawed at him day and night. The realization that he had abandoned Clara without knowing, that he had unknowingly left his daughter behind, consumed him. He thought about Sophia constantly, wondering how she had grown up without him, how different her life might have been had he known the truth. She had every right to be angry, every right to resent him, even if he hadn't been aware. He had failed her, whether he had known it or not. And Mrs. Rossi, his wife, the woman he had built a life with, was now at the center of a web of lies and manipulation. The more Marco uncovered, the less he recognized the woman he had married. Her desire for control had always been evident, but now, he saw it for what it truly was, an obsession. An obsession with power, with wealth, with maintaining her position at any cost. Marco knew he needed to act soon, but he couldn't afford to make a mistake. One wrong move, and everything could crumble. If Mrs. Rossi caught wind of his investigation, if she suspected he was onto her, she could move quickly to protect herself. And with the evidence of financial fraud and potential involvement in Clara's disappearance, Marco had no doubt she would do whatever it took to save her own skin. The days following Sophia's confrontation with Marco were long and heavy with uncertainty. Each morning she woke up in her small apartment, replaying the conversation in her head, wondering if she had pushed too hard or not hard enough. Part of her feared that Marco would do nothing, that he'd dismiss her accusations, unwilling to break the fragile surface of his carefully constructed life. The other part of her hoped she had ignited something in him, a desire for truth and justice, if not for himself, then for the family he never knew he had. Sophia tried to distract herself, throwing herself into taking care of her father and attending to the daily needs that never seemed to end. But no matter what she did, her thoughts kept drifting back to the mansion, to the quiet tension she had left behind. Would Marco investigate his wife's lies? Would he protect himself from the woman who had spent years weaving manipulation into their lives? Days passed, and Sophia began to wonder if she would ever hear from Marco again. Maybe he had decided it was easier to maintain the status quo, easier to believe Mrs. Rossi's version of events than confront the harsh reality of betrayal. After all, what man wanted to admit that the person he had shared his life with for so long had built it on lies? One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the city in shades of gold and deep blue, there was a knock at the door. Sophia's heart skipped as she opened it to find Marco standing on the threshold, his expression unreadable. "I didn't expect to see you," Sophia said, stepping aside to let him in. "I needed some time," Marco admitted, his voice low. "There's a lot to process. I've made mistakes, Sophia. More than I can count." He glanced around the modest apartment, a far cry from the grandeur of the Rossi mansion. It was the first time Marco had entered her world, and Sophia could see the realization sinking in. This was the life she had lived while he had remained in his opulent bubble. Sophia gestured to the worn sofa, and Marco sat down, his movements slow, as if the weight of everything was pressing down on him. "I've been doing some digging," he began, folding his hands together. "After you left the mansion, I couldn't ignore what you told me. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that you were right. So, I started looking into things." Sophia's pulse quickened. "What did you find?" Marco hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder. He handed it to her, and Sophia opened it to find pages of bank statements, legal documents, and private investigator reports. Her eyes skimmed over the numbers, the transactions, each more alarming than the last. Money had been siphoned from their joint accounts, just as Marco had suspected, and hidden in offshore accounts. There were also notes about Mrs. Rossi's suspicious behavior, her discreet dealings with individuals who had no apparent connection to the Rossi family, at least, not officially. "She's been paying people," Marco said quietly. "Paying them to manipulate situations in the household, to ensure she kept control of everything. Some of the staff, some outside contractors. It goes deeper than I realized." Sophia felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she pieced it together. Mrs. Rossi hadn't just manipulated Marco, she had manipulated everyone around her, pulling strings to ensure no one challenged her authority. It was a level of deceit Sophia hadn't fully comprehended before. "She paid off people to control the narrative," Marco continued, his voice tight. "To make sure I never questioned her decisions. And she's been hiding money, moving it around quietly, securing her own future. She was preparing for something, Sophia. Preparing to leave." Sophia looked up from the papers, her brow furrowed. "Leave? Why?" "I think she knew this was coming," Marco replied, leaning back in the chair. "She's been laying the groundwork for a quiet exit for years, just in case something like this happened. But now, I'm taking the steps to ensure that she leaves on my terms, not hers." Sophia didn't know what to say. Part of her had expected a dramatic showdown, a confrontation that would end with accusations thrown like daggers. But this, Marco's quiet, methodical approach, felt different. It was calculated, deliberate. He wasn't just reacting to the betrayal. He was protecting himself, and by extension, Sophia. "I've started the legal process to separate our finances," Marco explained. "I don't want a public spectacle, and I don't want this dragging through the courts. I've arranged for her to leave quietly, under confidential terms. She'll have enough to live comfortably, but I've locked down the rest. I'm not letting her take more than she's entitled to." The marriage will be dissolved without anyone knowing the full story. Sophia could hear the strain in his voice, the weariness of a man who had realized just how much of his life had been built on lies. But there was also resolve. Marco wasn't backing down. He wasn't letting Mrs. Rossi walk away with everything. Why quietly? Sophia asked, though she understood the reasoning. Marco had always been a man who valued his reputation, and a public divorce would undoubtedly draw attention, not just to the financial aspects but to the deeper, personal betrayals. I don't want this to affect the business, Marco said. The last thing I need is for our dirty laundry to be aired in the media. It would hurt the company, and I can't afford that. Not with everything I've built. I'm doing this to protect my legacy, and to protect you. Sophia blinked, surprised by his words. Me? You're my daughter, Marco said, his voice soft but firm. That changes everything. I can't undo the past, but I can make sure that from now on, you're taken care of. Mrs. Rossi won't be able to manipulate the situation anymore. She's out. The finality of his words settled over them like a heavy blanket. Sophia felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that Mrs. Rossi's hold on Marco, and their lives, was ending, but sadness for the years that had been lost, for the family they could have had. When will she leave? Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. In a few days, Marco said. It's already been arranged. There won't be a dramatic exit. No yelling, no public scenes. Just a quiet departure. Sophia nodded. It felt surreal, the way things were coming to an end without the fiery confrontation she had expected. But maybe this was better. Cleaner. More controlled. Mrs. Rossi would slip away quietly, just as she had controlled the narrative for years. The house felt different without Mrs. Rossi in it. The air was lighter, less oppressive, as if the mansion itself had been freed from the years of control and manipulation that had festered within its walls. It wasn't just the silence that marked her absence, but the sense that something deeper had shifted. Sophia could feel it as she walked through the grand foyer on her way to meet Marco in the study. Mrs. Rossi had left quietly, as Marco had arranged. There had been no confrontation, no dramatic exit, just a cold, understated departure that matched the life she had lived, controlling every situation from behind the scenes. And now, she was gone, leaving the Rossi estate to Marco and Sophia to rebuild something entirely new. When Sophia entered the study, she found Marco sitting at his desk, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He looked different too, more relaxed than she had ever seen him, though the weight of the past week still lingered in his eyes. As their gazes met, Sophia knew they were both thinking the same thing: it was time to move forward. How are you? Marco asked, his voice softer than she'd expected. Sophia shrugged, walking to the large windows that overlooked the sprawling garden. I don't know. I feel relieved, I guess. But also, I don't know where to go from here. Marco nodded, as if he understood completely. I've been thinking the same thing. There's a lot to process. A lot of things I wish I could go back and change, but we can't live in the past. No, Sophia agreed, turning to face him. We can't. For a moment, there was a comfortable silence between them. Sophia could see the regret etched on Marco's face, regret for the years he had missed, for the choices he hadn't made. But there was also something else there, something new, hope. The hope of a second chance, of building something better than what had come before. I want to make things right, Sophia, Marco said, standing up from his desk and crossing the room to stand beside her. I know I can't change the past, but I want to be part of your future. I want to help you, support you. My wealth, it's yours too now. I want you to have the life you deserve. Sophia's heart swelled at the sincerity in his voice, but she felt a knot form in her stomach at the idea of simply accepting everything he was offering. She had grown strong on her own, had faced challenges she never thought she'd survive, and the thought of relying on someone else, even her father, didn't sit right with her. She wasn't the same woman she had been when she first stepped into the Rossi mansion as a maid. She had found her own strength, her own independence, and she wasn't willing to give that up. I appreciate what you're offering, Sophia said carefully, but I don't want to just take your wealth. That's not why I came here. I didn't confront you because I wanted money or a handout. I wanted the truth, and now that I have it, I need to decide what to do next. Marco's brow furrowed slightly, concern flickering in his eyes. You don't have to prove anything to me, Sophia. You've been through enough. Let me help you. I'm not refusing your help, Sophia replied quickly, not wanting to shut him out. But if we're going to move forward, I want to do it on equal terms. I've thought a lot about what my mother would want. She didn't run from this life because she hated it, she ran because she didn't want me to get caught up in it, in all the manipulation and greed. Marco listened quietly, nodding for her to continue. I want to do something that honors her, Sophia said, her voice gaining strength. Something that helps people who've gone through what I've gone through. We have an opportunity to make something good come out of all of this. Marco's eyes softened as he watched her. What do you have in mind? I want to start a foundation, Sophia said, her heart pounding as she spoke the words she'd been holding onto for days. A charitable foundation in my mother's name. It would help women and families who are struggling, who've been manipulated or trapped in difficult situations. We could use the money you're offering to make a real difference. Marco's face lit up with pride as he listened to her plan. That's an incredible idea, he said, his voice filled with admiration. You're thinking about something bigger than just yourself. Your mother would be proud. Sophia smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. For so long, she had felt like she was fighting against forces bigger than her, like she had no control over her own life. But now, she had found a way to take that control back, to turn the pain and hardship she had endured into something meaningful. I don't want to just take what you're offering and walk away, Sophia continued. I want us to build this foundation together. As partners. Not as a way to make up for the past, but as a way to move forward. Marco was silent for a moment, clearly moved by her words. Then, he nodded, his eyes filled with respect. I'd like that, he said quietly. Let's do it. We'll build this foundation together. For the first time in a long while, Sophia felt hopeful. She had always been independent, always determined to stand on her own 2 feet. But this wasn't about independence, it was about partnership, about creating something new, something that would honor her mother's memory and give her life meaning beyond the pain of the past. I'm proud of you, Marco added, his voice thick with emotion. You've been through so much, and you've come out stronger. Your mother's legacy will live on through this, through you. I'm just grateful I get to be a part of it. Sophia felt her throat tighten as tears pricked the corners of her eyes. She hadn't expected to feel this way, to feel so connected to the man she had once resented, the father she had never known. But here they were, ready to start something new, something that would honor not just their family but the people who needed help the most. They spent the rest of the afternoon discussing ideas for the foundation, brainstorming ways they could make a real impact in the community. Marco had connections in business, while Sophia had the passion and drive to turn those resources into something tangible. Together, they sketched out the beginnings of what would become the Clara Foundation, named after Sophia's mother, a tribute to the woman who had sacrificed so much to protect her daughter. As the evening sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Sophia felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The Rossi mansion, once a place of tension and secrets, was now the starting point for something beautiful, something filled with hope and purpose.